This is an AQA Psychology GCSE revision video for the Paper 2 topic of social influence with a specific focus on conformity, Asch's study into conformity and the factors affecting conformity. So to begin, we need to consider what is conformity. A definition of conformity needs to consider and include two key points. Conformity overall is when a person changes their behaviour or their thoughts. So that is one part of the definition. And the second part of the definition, which is just as important as the first part, is that it is due to real or imagined pressure from another person or group. So, for example, an example of imagined pressure is just this idea in your head that you feel you have to do something because the people around you are also doing it. And so you change your behaviour. It's not something you would normally do, but you change your behaviour because you feel like you have to. Whereas real pressure would be a group of friends telling you that you need to do something that you wouldn't normally do in order to remain their friend, for example. So Asch wanted to investigate how people responded to group pressure in this context, in this idea of conformity. So in order to do this, he used a task where the answer was obvious. Okay, the answer was clearly wrong. And the key term that the examiners will be impressed if you could use is unambiguous. So if something is ambiguous, that bit that I am highlighting in green, that would mean it's unclear. So for something to be unambiguous, it means it is clear. It's a bit annoying because it's like a sort of double negative. However, the word unambiguous is important to use. So Asch used a task where the answer was unambiguous and he wanted to see if people would be influenced by others. So in order to do that, he used the famous line task, which you might recognise from this image here. And his sample consisted of 123 male American students. They thought what they were participating in was a vision test, because if you look at the image, it does look a bit like something you would do at an optician's. The task they were asked to complete was to choose which line matched the target line. They were asked in groups, so in the presence of others. However, those others were Confederates. They were actors. They were in on it. There was only one real participant in that group. So each participant sat with between 6 to 8 others that were Confederates, they were actors, and they sat around a table. Now, the genuine or naive participant, because they're naive as they don't know what's really going on, they were always sat near the end of the round table. So they might have been last but one person to give their answer. In total, there were 18 trials, so this task was performed 18 times. As you can see, I'm just adding times 18 onto the image. Now, 12 of the 18 trials is when the Confederates deliberately gave a wrong answer. So in this example, they may have deliberately given the answer A or B, because you can see that C is clearly the one that is the same length. So in 12 of the 18 trials, that's when the wrong answer was given. In terms of the results of the 12 critical trials, participants gave a wrong answer and therefore conformed 37% of the time. Okay, and there were individual differences. For example, and these figures are important, 25% didn't conform at all, which means that 75% did conform at least once. In conclusion, Asch suggested people are influenced by group pressure even when the task is obvious, even when it's got a clear-cut answer, and he called it the Asch effect. He named it after himself. He also suggested, however, when we think about that statistic of 75% of people conforming at least once and 25% not conforming at all, he suggested actually these results do show a high level of independence, again thinking about his overall result of 37%. So a lot of participants did go against the group opinion. So this can count as evidence of how people are able to resist the pressure to conform, and that not every individual will conform, and that will make a bit more sense later on in the video when we look at the factors that affect conformity. So thinking about how we can evaluate a study, a reminder that we evaluate studies in psychology using GRAVE. There are lots of parts of GRAVE that apply to Asch. For example, ethics. Ethics is a very big one in Asch's study. Although it's not one of the questions on the screen, I will briefly discuss it before giving you the opportunity to think about the answers on the screen. So Asch deceived his participants. He lied to them. He misled them deliberately, which is definitely unethical, and it is one of the ethical guidelines in psychology that we shouldn't knowingly mislead our participants. So Asch did break that ethical guideline. It was also unethical for Asch to use confederates because, again, that was deception. The participant felt that those people were other participants. However, they were actors. And some people would even make the claim that Asch should have protected his participants from harm. Although this one can be quite difficult to argue, the participants did feel embarrassed, but it's no more embarrassment than they would experience in their everyday life. And for something to be unethical and for a researcher to break the protection from harm guideline, it would have to be something really quite severe where the participant is very upset or in pain. So it's slightly unethical with protection from harm as well, but the main one is deception. So in terms of other important parts of GRAVE, we've got generalizability, application, and validity. So I would like you to pause the video and think about the answers to the 3 questions on screen, and in 5 seconds I'll talk through the answers. Okay, so the first one, Asch's study only really explains conformity in individualistic cultures like America, which is where the study was carried out, and the UK, because we have a very similar culture to America. So the problem here is there are cultures known as individualistic cultures, which is the UK and the USA, which is where it's important for individuals to achieve their own potential. For example, finding a life partner and getting a good job and buying your own house. However, other cultures, which are known as collectivist cultures, care much more about the community, their family and the group. So when choosing a partner, they would consider more what the family wants, what the community values, and making sure the partner fits with those goals rather than their own personal interests. So research has shown that conformity in collectivist cultures has a much higher rate than in individualistic cultures, which means Asch's findings aren't very generalizable. They don't apply to other cultures, such as China, where conformity rates are found to be higher because they value the group much more. So that's one issue. The cultural differences make it very hard to generalize Asch's findings. In that paragraph, you could also include the key details of the fact that there were, although it seems like a large amount, there were only 123 participants. They were all male. So 123 is not going to represent the entire world population. And of course, it's only males, which means there is gender bias because we don't know if females would conform to an unambiguous task in the same way. Moving on to application then. Asch's study has been criticised for not being relevant anymore, no longer relevant. It's called a child of its time. And this is because it was conducted in the 50s in America when it was a particularly conformist time. The government was dominated by something known as McCarthyism, which basically meant that if you didn't agree with the beliefs of society at that time, which were more communist rather than capitalist, then you would be excluded and you would be badly punished. So people were really scared to deviate from the majority and to not do what the government or not think what the government wanted them to think. And so conformity is going to be more common back then, at the time Asch did his study. So this suggests the Asch effect may not be consistent over time and might not be so valid anymore. And then finally, the overall validity, the ecological validity in particular, it all links to this task. Now, conformity is more about real life, so things like underage drinking, underage smoking, your fashion sense, all of those real life examples of what conformity is. So for Asch to study that using a task which didn't really mean much to participants, a very artificial task and a very artificial situation, means that his study lacks ecological validity. This doesn't reflect the everyday situations that people actually conform in. And also the group the participant was in wasn't the same as being around friends or people you are familiar with. These were complete strangers. So it's not a very good measurement or representation of conformity. And so these results might not be valid in the everyday life. Therefore, that term ecological validity is important. So the downwards arrow and the word ecological there to represent the fact that this study is low in ecological validity. So now we've evaluated Asch's study, what we need to look at is the social factors that affect conformity and the dispositional factors. So starting with the social factors. This is when people conform due to their surroundings. So the word social means other people. It's due to things outside of the individual. And the first factor is the group size. So you can see here, Asch conducted his study with a number of different amounts of Confederates present. So from 0 all the way up to 15. And if we just have a look at what the graph shows, it shows that conformity does increase as the number of people present increases. Okay, so you can see that by looking at the X and the Y axes, the X axis moving in the right direction and the Y axis moving in the upward direction. However, you notice around here that effect starts to wear off. And so the more people in the group, the greater the pressure is to conform, up to a certain point. So you can take one or two of these figures to learn, maybe just one. But the main point here is that adding more Confederates after sort of 3 or 4 made very little difference. And in fact, beyond 9, it started to decrease, possibly because it becomes a lot less believable and convincing. The second social factor is anonymity. Anonymity means to be anonymous. It means for you not to be recognised or for the things you are saying or thinking to not be known that it is you. Okay, so when Asch asked participants to write down the answer rather than say it out loud, that significantly reduced the conformity. And that is because you don't feel the pressure as much. You aren't going to look silly and be rejected by the group because they don't know the answer is yours. So there's much less conformity because you are anonymous and therefore you don't have as much pressure to look silly, and therefore you're not worried about being rejected because you're anonymous and people wouldn't know that it was your answer. The third and final social factor that affects conformity is task difficulty. So Asch made the task harder by making the lines much more similar in length. And because the task got harder, this meant that conformity increased as well. Added by my green arrow there on screen. So as the task gets harder, conformity also increases. And that again is possibly because people lose confidence in their ability to know the right answer and so look to others for the answer instead, therefore changing their minds, changing their answer to be in line with the group. Moving on to dispositional factors now. So these are to do with a person themselves internally, their personality. It's something about the person themselves. their disposition. So you might have heard of people saying, oh, you've got a nervous disposition. It basically means that their personality is that of they're quite nervous, so they might be very shy, or their voice might shake when they speak. So when we talk about disposition, we're talking about the individual, their internal characteristics. And the first dispositional factor is personality. Locus of control, to be specific. So a locus of control breaks down into two. Internal, which is the green, and then external, which is the red. So someone with an internal locus of control believes that they make things happen. They're very confident in their own ability to get a job, for example, and determine their own future. They believe in themselves. Whereas someone with an external locus of control, their point of control, their locus of control about their own life, is that things happen to them, and that there's nothing they can do to control their behaviour or their future or their outcomes, and everything happens to them. Everything that's negative happens to them. They might believe in star signs and superstition. Maybe they saw one magpie instead of two that day, and so that's the reason they got a low score on their test, for example. So in terms of conformity, someone with an internal locus of control feels they have a lot of control, okay, over their own behaviour, whereas someone with an external doesn't have control over their own behaviour or doesn't feel they do. Therefore, someone with an external locus of control is going to be more influenced by others and conform because they let things and people outside of them dictate their behaviour. The second dispositional factor is expertise, and this is the last dispositional factor. So this expertise means being an expert, knowing your stuff, basically. A maths teacher is an expert in maths. And so specifically maths, the maths problems that maths teachers might have to complete, because they have the expertise, they are confident in their own answers, and they're therefore less likely to go along with someone else because they have the confidence in their own knowledge. So expertise and experience increase your confidence, and therefore people with more expertise become less conformist. So those are the factors that affect conformity. There are 3 social and 2 dispositional. Just to recap, the social factors are group size, anonymity, task difficulty, and the dispositional factors are personality and expertise. So that concludes the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.